Welcome, everyone. Before introducing today's speaker, Professor Robert Edelman, I would like to draw your attention to an event recently added to our calendar. Namely, at noon on Thursday, January 31st, in room 1644, journalist and activist Konstantin Geberd will present on Jewish revival in contemporary Poland, origins, evolution, and new direction. Please also join us for the next Greece Noon lecture on Wednesday, February the 6th. Our speaker will be Irina Aristarchova, Associate Professor of Art and Design, History of Art and Women's Studies at the University of Michigan, who moved to Ann Arbor this fall and recently accepted our invitation to become a Greece Faculty Associate. Her lecture, entitled Dangerous Art, From Varvara Stepanova to Pussy Riot, so Pussy Riot is in the horizon all the time, will be delivered next time. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Robert Edelman, a professor of Russian history and the history of sport at the University of California, San Diego. He has written a number of well-known, widely recognized, and widely used books. Gentry Politics on the Eve of the Russian Revolution, The Nationalist Party, 1905-1917, published in 1980. Proletarian Peasants, the Revolution of 1905 in Russia's Southwest, published in 1987. Then a slight, or even I would say dramatic change of topic, Serious Fun, a history of spectator sports in the USSR, Oxford University Press, 1993. The book won the annual book awards of the Amateur Athletic Foundation of Los Angeles and the North American Society of Sport Historian. The fourth book was entitled Spartak Moscow, A History of the People's Team in the Workers' State, published in Cornell University Press, 2009. This book is itself a Champion Prize winner, having won the annual book prize at the North American Society of Sport Historians, the Reginald Zelnick Prize, awarded by the Association of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies for the best monograph on Slavic, East European, and Eurasian history, and Choice Magazine's award for outstanding academic titles. I can go on to tell you about the prestigious awards and the wonderful publications, other wonderful publications and the wonderful works Professor Edelman has done or is doing. But I would like to think a little bit about what has been done. One way to think about Professor Edelman's work is to see it as a unique intellectual trajectory. He shifted his scholarly focus from the Russian Revolution, the very center of scholarly debates in the second half of the 20th century. Sorry, I'm a specialist in the 19th century. To what had for many years been considered marginal, that is, to previously understudied aspects of Soviet mass culture and sport. And he produced groundbreaking research in the history of Soviet sport. His work also can be seen as an enormously important act of expanding disciplinary boundaries. For Professor Edelman, individual statesmen, television bureaucrats, soccer players, and journalists count every bit as much as institutions and the highest authorities. In a very subtle way, he connects the optimism of sport leaders in 1956 with the sense of excitement that emerged with the beginning of the Khrushchev thaw and people coming back from the concentration camps. Subtle analysis of the complex interplay between sports and politics distinguishes Professor Edelman's research and makes it a groundbreaking work of understanding Soviet civilization, the life of ordinary people, and their attitude to the regime they feared. I want to conclude on a personal note. For the generation of my parents, Spartak Moscow was the most revered soccer team. Its performance on the field fueled my father's belief in the future as much as the secret speech and the beginning of the Thor deed. I can personally attest that what Professor Edelman has revealed is not only true, but close to the heart of many Muscovites. Spartak champion.
What an introduction. That was just wonderful. Thank you. It is truly great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for all of you braving the elements. At least it seems that way to me. It's also great to be in Michigan because this is actually where, in some sense, I became a historian of sport. I had been collecting material about was then the contemporary situation during perestroika of spectator sport, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it. And Ron Suni invited me to talk about it here. And then when it was over, a bunch of us retired to his house, and Jeff Ely showed up. He'd had the advantage of not having heard the talk, and suggested that I should write a book about this. And so I did. And I can fairly say it actually changed my life in some ways for better, some ways for worse. And I'm grateful to everybody who is here. Well, what I'm going to talk today about is not really what my ongoing research is. I'm working on a transnational global history of sports during the Cold War, in very, very early stages of it, but rather something that occurred to me while I was watching the London Olympic Games. So I have two questions to start out with. The first question is, how many of you watched any part of the Olympic Games? Pretty much everybody. That's cool, right? My second question is, who won?
What?
Who won the medal count? Good question. China? No. The U.S.? Not so fast. Sovietsky Soyuz. The Soviet Union. Why? Because if you put together all the medals of former Soviet republics, in fact, they won more than the United States. Now, I'm sure the Georgians wouldn't want to be, lumped in that group. But, it occurred to me that here we are 20 plus years after the collapse of the system that created this sporting system of Olympic sport, that somehow in some small or even larger ways, elements of it may have continued to exist that permitted this kind of residual success. So what I want to talk about today then is the somewhat curious relationship between, again, Soviet communism and the international Olympic movement. Certainly, as most of you know, in November of 1917, when the Bolsheviks took power, they had a to-do list. 1, making peace with Germany. 2, giving land to the masses of peasants. And 3, providing bread for a starving population. Sports was fairly far down on the list. Actually, to tell you the truth, it was not on the list at all. But soon, the immense matter of reorganizing all aspects of life along socialist lines was very much on the Bolshevik agenda. When Russia pulled out of the war in April 1918 and the Civil War ensued, soldiers in the new Red Army had to be healthy and fit. Unfortunately, many of them were not. The same problem had plagued the Tsarist army, and this difficulty put the question of physical culture and sport at the forefront of the party's concerns. From the very first months of the revolution, sport and the military were closely linked under the aegis of Sjevovic, the organization that was given the task of training the new army. A close relationship with sport and the military was quickly established, and over the entire course of Soviet history, it never completely disappeared. So what then was to be done about sport, or perhaps better to ask, should anything have been done at all And here I am sorry to say that the socialist legacy was largely useless. Neither Marx nor Lenin had written much on the subject of sport beyond a few platitudes about sound minds and sound bodies. Exercise and fitness were fine, but modern sport, especially as it had evolved according to the master narrative in the United Kingdom, was problematic. Most of the leaders of the electorally successful pre-World War I socialist parties were intellectuals who were dismissive of sport in particular and popular culture in general. They adopted these attitudes despite the fact that their imputed followers, though working masses, were obsessed by just these very sorts of cultural opiates. Much of the left thought professional spectator sport, with its unruly plebeian fans, was yet another way to divert the masses from the class struggle. Like the good Victorians they were deep down, the socialist leaders believed in the concept of rational recreation every bit as much as the right and honorable gentlemen of the middle and upper classes. Strolling through the countryside and solving the problems of humanity was for them much to be preferred to standing on the terraces of a football stadium and screaming irrationally for a homicide composed of paid mercenaries. If the left had strong doubts about the professional entertainment model of sport, it was equally uncomfortable with Olympian amateurism. Men and women of the mind, they had no clear theory of the human body. By contrast, Pierre de Coubertin, founder of the modern Olympics, in his reworking of the doctrine of muscular Christianity, placed the body informed by the mind at the core of Olympism, with its commitment to a version of amateurism that sought to exclude most working men and all women from participation. So if socialists had no time for Olympism, it must be noted that the Olympic movement had no time for socialism. Coubertin's pre-World War I Olympism, which was also a product of the Victorians, was a response to the rise of professional sport, but more broadly it was also a response to the electoral successes of parliamentary socialist parties in Western and Central Europe. If Coubertin's elitism and misogyny made him uncomfortable with the left, he was also unhappy with the rise of political nationalism, which was the right's mass political response to socialism. Nationalism found one of its most tangible, even corporeal expressions in sport. Put most crudely, the right got sport and the left did not. A rampant masculinity that fostered the fitness needed for success in war fueled the international and imperial rivalries that would lead to such enormous tragedy in 1914. Neither socialism's much vaunted international proletarian solidarity, nor the historical distortion of the Olympic truce were able to prevent World War I. Coubertin's initial attraction to sport had been driven by France's bruised nationalism after its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. In time, however, he came to see nationalism's dangers and sought to use sport as a force for peace and harmony. He wished to foster a politically conservative version of sporting internationalism that could counter the plebeian and often violent lower orders, as well as the more chauvinist or jingoistic elements of the right. Olympism was then marked by a confused mix of the liberal and the conservative, the national and the international. As proof of his internationalism, the French Coubertin had come to admire the British. Yet the parts of Great Britain he admired most were the sports-loving public schools, Eton, Harrow, Rugby, and of course Hogwarts, which were the basic unities of the sporting male bastion that produced so many of the empire's military officers and colonial administrators, not to mention political leaders. In other words, Coubertin admired a part of the United Kingdom that was thoroughly nationalist, not to mention imperialist. These contradictions and confusions were at the very core of the early Olympic movement, which was almost entirely European and American in its composition. While the games were internationalist in spirit, though, their fundamental units were nation-states. Very quickly it was decided that individuals could not compete on their own. Friendly contests for minimally tangible prizes were supposed to mitigate the tensions between nations, yet the cauldron of competition could just as easily exacerbate those tensions. Olympic internationalism was driven by the same spirit that propelled the numerous world's fairs and global expositions of the late 19th and 20th centuries. In fact, In 1900 and 1904, they were coincided and part of and subsumed under World's Fairs. Conservative internationalism, of the type that drove the World's Fairs, was triumphantly capitalist and often unrepentantly imperial. Soviet pavilions would appear at international expositions during the 1930s, but they occupied only a fraction of the total terrain. Socialists were not unwelcome, but they had to have control of their own country, and at this time, of course, there was only one nation that fit that description. So examined from the historical perspective, it would seem both reformist and revolutionary socialists on the one hand, and Olympic Games and World's Fairs on the other had little in common. So let's now return to the early Bolsheviks, who had found neither of capitalism's two approaches to sport acceptable. Neither professionalism nor amateurism, both professionalism and amateurism raised serious problems. First, we call the professional entertainment model. This approach was bad in Bolshevik eyes because it commodified athletes' bodies and generated profits for the entrepreneurs of the popular culture industries that had diverted the workers from their central historical task, the class struggle. Here, much of the left shared a disgust for popular culture with many conservative thinkers who found such pastimes to be proof of the debased nature of society's lower orders. Those who wished to defend society's hierarchies contrasted popular culture with high culture. For elites, ballet, classical music, serious novels, and difficult poetry were manifestations of the cultural capital that justified their domination of the subordinate social groups. And then amateurism. In the first half of the 19th century, the young gentlemen in training of the highly sporting public schools were supposed to be amateurs. Yet the word amateur itself was rarely used at the time. The term gentleman was used instead, but it masked many complexities. If boys were supposed to learn courage, cooperation, and tenacity by playing team sports, they were not to try too hard or care too much. The excellence and prowess of Britain's future leaders was supposed to be effortless and graceful, as if given by nature or God. Practices were less important than games, and games were occasions to exhibit sportsmanship and fair play. By the second half of the 19th century, however, the gentleman amateurisms had been well overwhelmed by a flood of working-class athletes and fans who were taking over their pastimes and games. In response, a new, more explicit and codified version of amateurism was consciously constructed by U.S., British, and European elites as a response to the emergence and success of professional sport, whose athletes and fans cared passionately about winning within and outside of the rules. Fair play had little meaning for social groups who drew their identities in large measure from the ways they consumed their communities had come to practice sport, most notably but not exclusively soccer, which emerged from factories, pubs, neighborhoods, and places of worship. This troubled the property and educated who came up with what they thought to be a solution. By making sport a hobby rather than a way of earning a living, elites could exclude the laboring classes. Beginning with the 1880s, even in some cases before that, a broad range of national and international federations emerged to organize sport. These were all voluntary, and they were run by those who could afford the travel and time to run them. Many of these groups explicitly forbade in their charters the participation of those who worked with their hands and bodies. Coubertin codified and dressed up this new type of amateurism with an Enlightenment-derived positive reading of ancient Greek history, which he saw as the cradle of democracy. Yet, as most of us know, that very democracy excluded slaves, women, and foreigners, none of whom could take part in the games. If the good baron's fundamental inspiration had in fact been Britain's rugby school, the Philo-Hellenism then sweeping Europe, especially Germany, nevertheless made it necessary to tip one's hat to the Greeks. In the late 19th century, archaeologists from the imperial powers of Europe were crawling over the lands of what had been ancient Greece, digging up relics, and transporting them back to the museums of their great cities. Coubertin felt compelled to tap into this movement, which seemed to symbolize elite culture for the continent's dominant classes. So neither professionalism nor amateurism pleased the new leaders in the Kremlin. As a result, the Bolsheviks refused to take part in the Olympic Games, And for their part, the good gentlemen of the IOC wanted no part of this leather-jacketed bunch of scruffy political fanatics. During the 1920s and 30s, nearly all strands of the political left continued to view the Olympics as bourgeois, elitist, misogynist, and Eurocentric. Instead, social democrats and communists who detested each other organized sports clubs for workers of all genders and put on their own Olympiads, which competed for attention with the IOC's games. These so-called People's Games were huge festivals with a more relaxed criteria for participation. The levels of performance of the proletarian sportswomen and men at these events may have been lower, but the crowds were often larger than those who showed up at the bourgeois Olympics, especially during the 1920s. So if you look at the newsreel footage of these events, neither Antwerp in 1920 nor Paris in 1924 or Amsterdam in 1928, if you actually look at the newsreel footage, you see many empty seats in not very large stadiums. It's really only during the 30s that the Olympics take on the trappings of modern mega events, with the main arenas of Los Angeles and Berlin each having 100,000 places, and the new technologies of the mass media quickly beaming results and stories throughout the planet. While the political leaders of the USSR remained aloof from these increasingly popular spectacles, Soviet coaches, journalists, sportswomen, and sportsmen began to wonder how they would do against the world's best athletes. There were tentative contacts between Olympic leaders and the State Sports Committee in 1932, but no Soviets showed up in Los Angeles. After 1923, with the Popular Front dictating Soviet foreign policy in the wake of Nazis' triumph, there was no way the Kremlin's athletes would have shown up in Berlin. So, how then do we go from pre-World War II isolation to acceptance in 1974 when the IOC awards the Olympic Games to Moscow for 1980? Clearly, World War II had everything to do with changing the context and meaning of international sport. The victory over the Axis, in which the Soviet Union played the leading role, brought the USSR into the community of nations. By the end of the 40s, there were many new states that called themselves communist. Most of them had joined the United Nations. Membership in the wide range of international sports federations soon followed. Eventually, the USSR applied to join the IOC in 1951. They were accepted despite the misgivings of Olympic leaders who knew Soviet athletes were paid performers. So what then did communism and Olympism have in common when the Soviets jumped so thoroughly onto the Olympic bandwagon starting again in 1952? Well, before I answer that question, it has to be remembered that the post-war Soviet sports machine, which seemed to burst on the scene after 1945, especially 1952 at the Helsinki Olympics, did not simply fall out of the sky. It had a prehistory which started in the late 20s. Soviet leaders in education, defense, and health had already begun to organize that system that emerged more completely after the war and also was developed and extended in the 1930s. So Soviet sport, in its sort of moment of origin, was very much a product of the Stalinist period, and it retained many of its earliest characteristics right up to the very end of Soviet power. Under communism, there was a clear market for sporting spectacles. Fans could accept or reject the events offered by the state, but in a command economy, the market did not determine which sports were favored by the regime. It was useful for political reasons if it was useful for political reasons to support one event or another, that in fact occurred even if the public for that event was limited or even non-existent. Well, here I would like to shift gears from the historical to the topical, from fact to opinion, from evidence to assertion. And I would argue that there were 7 things that communism and Olympism and Olympic sports shared. 7 things that formed a basis for cooperation. These were modernity, urbanism, internationalism, social improvement, didacticism, formal amateurism, and grandiosity. This list, of course, is neither inclusive nor structured in any particular order. So, number 1, Both movements accepted modernity, which both understood to be dynamic, industrial, and urban. Both saw sport as emblematic of the modern world, and if, as the Soviets did, one wanted to become modern, then one had to embrace sport. The modern Olympic Games took place in modern cities, and in the process they both expressed and constituted a mature capitalism that was dynamic, industrial, urban, and optimistic. 2. In the US and at times in the UK, pastoral myths were invoked to justify sport. But the countryside, with its harsh demands for physical labor, was not a fertile ground for modern organized sports. The Olympics were not part of the rural world. For the Soviets, sport was similarly an urban activity. The overwhelming peasant majority of the population, imprisoned by tradition, did not engage in modern sports with their rules, structures, records, and schedules. There were never any Soviet myths of the pastoral, no fields of dreams carved out of friendly neighborhood collective farms. 3. Both communism and Olympism were internationalist and saw themselves as forces for peace. For socialists and communists, the cherished fraternal internationalism of the working class was thought to be a way of preventing war. For their part, the IOC's leaders had promoted the legend of an ancient Olympic truce. They believed friendly competition was a way of contesting dangerous forms of political nationalism. They prefigured Norbert Elias's famous theory of the civilizing process, in which sports were the very opposite of war. Rules were agreed upon before the contests in order to limit the violence and death that marked the pre-modern world. Yet when it came to the matter of internationalism, there was a fundamental contradiction in both movements. Athletes took part in the Olympic Games not as individuals, but as representatives of nations. They marched in opening ceremonies as nations. Anthems and flags became parts of victory ceremonies, fanning nationalism in ways that were not always healthy. These moments could inspire national pride and patriotism, but just as easily they could morph into ugly chauvinism and racism. At the same time, it should be noted that they could, in rare instances, serve as platforms for protest. For its part, the USSR was a multinational state which faced similar tensions. In constantly varying degrees, the nations within that state were able to keep their own languages, cultures, and histories. Yet this union was always an unstable arrangement, and when the USSR collapsed, many argued it came apart along national lines. Some of those people are actually in this room. There was always a tension between the goal of a multinational Soviet state and the aspirations of the various republics, which were allowed a strong, if oscillating, measure of cultural autonomy. 4. Both communism and Olympism believed in the possibility of social improvement and the capacity of humans to change for the better. Neither movement accepted the idea of an immutable human nature. Both had visions of a better world. People, performances, societies, and cultures all could get better. Humanity was not the prisoner of the present. As a result, later critics would dismiss both movements as utopian. For the Olympian, this vision was best expressed by the famously liberal slogan of faster, higher, stronger, adopted in 1921. For the Soviets, this striving took the form of the bright and shining future. Olympism always sold hope as one of its main attractions. For better or for worse, the USSR did the same. 5. For sport to propel social and cultural change, it could not simply be entertaining. It had to be educational as well. The Olympic movement justified its exalted status by claiming sport taught important life lessons and constructed healthy and useful citizens. Soviet mass culture and sport in particular were also supposed to be didactic. This emphasis was supposed to distinguish communist culture from the irrational garbage churned out by capitalist entertainment industries. Yet of the many forms of popular culture produced in the USSR, sport with its inescapable spontaneity proved to be a particularly slippery tool in the hands of a party state that sought to control its citizens. The implicit and explicit lessons in many Soviet cultural forms could have no impact if no one was watching, listening, or reading. 6. Both movements came to accept the codes of formal amateurism. The modern Olympics did this from their very origins, emulating, so they thought, an ancient Greek ideal that was never perfectly practiced. Amateurism, though, was not a static concept. It was always changing in dialectical relationship with a continually evolving professionalism. Definitions varied from era to era and sport to sport, and the constantly changing rules were evaded from the start in the 19th century as capitalist companies, universities, and militaries found multiple ways of supporting athletes. Simply put, the shamateur was not a Soviet invention. Early Soviet athletes were also called amateurs, but they were rewarded before World War II with good salaries. Little was done to keep this a secret, as they did not have to follow Olympic eligibility standards. Only in 1947 did they come to abandon open professionalism in order to appear to conform to the codes of amateurism followed by most international sports federations. This system proved more efficient than the patchwork of subsidies and privileges given to Olympic athletes in capitalist countries. And by the last decade of the Cold War, the West had grown tired of losing to the state professionals of the East. There were demands to open up the Games to all athletes. Under Juan Antonio Samaranch, head of the IOC, the Olympic Committee was happy to oblige, turning the Games into the hugely profitable commercial spectacle of the best against the best that it has become today. And finally, the efforts of both movements in pursuit of their beliefs were characterized by pomposity, grandiosity, and hypocrisy. Well, come on. Let's try this. There we go. Okay, all Olympic opening ceremonies have been highly pompous, with the possible exception of the last one. They're most definitely not carnivalesque. And why should the 1980 opening ceremony in Moscow have been any different? Here it is, and you'll see the reference to ancient Greece.
На игры приехали спортсмены большинства государств всех континентов. Стадион аплодировал каждой команде, в равной мере отдавая должное всем участникам Олимпиады. Разве что быть чуть более темпераментным, основная...
If you look in the back, you can see Gorby. That's Grecian on the right. This is the Olympic hymn, if you want pompous music.
Живут и работают четвертый месяц на космической орбите наши неутомимые труженики, космонавты Леонид Попов и Валерий Рюмин. Они передают нам свои приветствия и пожелания.
Сегодня, в день открытия игр Олимпиады, шлем всем вас космических высот горячий сердечный привет.
For those of you who had Soviet experience, this next series of tropes will be familiar. Do you want to name the nationalities in question, Ron? No, this is Tajiks. No, you'll get to your Georgians. The Georgians you'll get to, they're the best dancers, though. Tajiks. Well, that's what they're telling us. I mean, they could be lying. It wouldn't be the first time, right? This guy's playing air guitar here, right? Now, these are Estonians. As you can see, a lovely people, very gifted. very intelligent, but choreographically challenged. They what?
They sing.
Yes, they do, and they have great musical tradition, too. Here, you Georgians. Notice, please, right? All the cool steps are being done by men, and the women just kind of, walk around like this, I wasn't kidding, right? Here they come. Whoop! Now the question is this whole thing a multicultural minstrel show, or is it an expression of a Russian-centered empire? And here comes the answer. I'd be interested to see how you read this, right? So what do we got? We got one giant kalinka, right? What does this tell us? I guess. The Chinese did it. Now here, for those who are interested in sexual gender roles, here are young boys with horses between their legs, young girls with dolls between their legs. And just so fast gymnastics that you are familiar with these events should not be excluded, here we have some. Now, it has to be noted that this opening ceremony did not spring fully formed from the brains of Soviet theatrical directors, and rather they were very much drawn from the famous Physical Culture Day parades, which took place on Physical Culture Day every summer in Red Square, starting in the 1930s and going on until the 50s. And these are images which are probably familiar to a lot of you. I thought I'd show you some of them anyway, because they're almost always featured in Western and even Soviet documentaries about Soviet sport. So this is a kind of melange of images from the late 30s. There's a narration here which is, you'll find, has not been substantiated by recent scholarship. Let's just put it that way. See if we can pick everybody out here.
The 20s gone, the joyous, spontaneous crowds. In the 1930s, things became organized, systematized, lined up neatly beneath the double image of Joseph Stalin, the one of flesh and blood, and the giant painted portrait. All Russia was marching in step and singing in unison. Praise to the great Stalin.
Kalinin and Molotov? These are the famous Nemensky brothers who turned out to be police spies. I don't know who that is. If anybody does, Varashilov?
Pictures of the press sisters, or as we call them, the press brothers.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about that. Okay, now. The parades, though, were only one part of the Soviet sports scene. The other part was spectator sport, mainly soccer, which looked very different. On the surface, the parades seemed to be totalitarianism, but they actually turned out to be contested terrain. This was very well demonstrated by a Michigan PhD, Karen Petrone, in her book on Soviet celebrations. It turns out they were contested terrain, so each group got a certain amount of time, and what certain groups did expressed their particular take on Soviet sport, but I would argue on Soviet reality as well. And so in the case of the Spartak Sports Society, about which I've written, in 1936, starting in 1936 and every year thereafter, they sewed a giant green carpet, rolled it out onto Red Square, and played a soccer game for 43 minutes on Red Square in front of the party leadership on the Lenin Mausoleum. These are the Starston brothers, Andre on the left.
Когда Николай вышел на самую середину из команды, вдруг возникло удивительное зрелище. Древняя площадь столицы превратилась в невиданный в мире стадион. Небывалый матч на Красной площади две сильнейших футбольных команды «Спартака». Косулев Александр Васильевич порекомендовал сыграть. Надо, говорит, Василию Ивановичу показать. Сталин увлекся, было интересно смотреть. Он первый раз, по-моему, смотрел овощи. Он хлопает, записывал голову.
Nikolai on the right.
Оглядываясь назад, перспектива.
Okay, what was Spartak, what were the Starston brothers trying to do here? They were trying to bring a bit of genuine sport with spontaneity, with unpredictability, and a good deal less order into this otherwise highly organized and constrained and disciplined spectacle. So I want to show you some scenes from football, soccer in the late 1940s that show the way, in fact, soccer was consumed. Now we're going to have a quiz here in a second. Who is that man? Who can tell me who that man is? All you experts on Soviet society. What? He'll come back again. Someone associated with sport. Sinyavsky. Did I hear Sinyavsky? No. There he is again. That's Vadim Sinyavsky, the most famous Soviet sportscaster of the post-war period.